You know, every once in a while, history gives us a moment so quiet, so heavy, that even the air around it seems to stand still. And if you look at the whole sweep of World War II, those 6 long years filled with fire and fear and sacrifice, you'll notice something strange. The end of that war, the true final breath of it, didn't come with cheering crowds or roaring engines or fireworks lighting up the night. No. It came on a gray morning out in Tokyo Bay, on the steel deck of a battleship where hundreds of men gathered with solemn faces, trying to understand that the world they knew was changing right beneath their feet. And the thing is, if you listen closely to the memories of those who were there, you can almost hear it, that hush, that soft exhale, like a wounded planet letting out the breath it had been holding since 1939. Before we dive too deep, let me just take a second to say this. If you enjoy stories like these, stories that go beyond dates and numbers and try to bring the past back to life, go ahead and subscribe, tap the like button, maybe even share this with someone who loves history as much as you do. It helps more than you'd think. Alright, now let's step back into that morning. It was September 2nd, 1945, though many on board didn't need a calendar to remind them. They felt it in their bones. Dawn broke slowly over Tokyo Bay, with low clouds drifting like old ghosts above the water. The USS Missouri, that giant of American steel, stood still, its deck scrubbed clean, its flags sharp and bright in the breeze. And perched on that enormous ship were officers, sailors, photographers, generals from different nations, each carrying the weight of millions of lives behind them. Some had fought from one end of the Pacific to the other. Others had watched cities burn, friends fall, families vanish. And now they stood shoulder to shoulder on polished teakwood, waiting for the last act of the war. General Douglas MacArthur was the man standing at the center of it all. Tall, composed, with that old familiar pipe clenched between his teeth, though he didn't smoke it much that morning. People who served under him said his presence felt like a stone wall, solid, immovable, proud. But even MacArthur wasn't immune to the emotions creeping through the crowd. He'd seen the Pacific War from the beaches of the Philippines to the return campaigns across countless islands. He knew what this moment meant. The end of a conflict that had swallowed millions of lives. The closing of a door no one wanted to open again. Around him stood representatives from the United States, Britain, China, the Soviet Union, Australia, Canada, France, the Netherlands, and New Zealand. They came in crisp uniforms, their rows of medals clinking softly, faces stern and serious. They weren't there for spectacle. They were there to formalize what had already been decided in fire and rubble. Japan had agreed to surrender, but words spoken in a radio message weren't enough. This, here on this deck, was the moment the world needed. A signature, a document, a line drawn in ink that said, "It's over, it's finally over." But before the Japanese delegation arrived, the Americans on board couldn't help glancing out at the distant shoreline of Japan. That land had been an enemy for 4 long years, a place where so many of their brothers never returned from. Some of the men on the Missouri had fought in the battles of Okinawa, Iwo Jima, Saipan. Some still carried shrapnel in their skin. Many carried memories they rarely spoke of. And now here they were, only miles from the heart of the empire that had sent swarms of aircraft and waves of soldiers against them. Strange, isn't it, to stand so close to the place you've spent years fighting and to be told the war is over? The Japanese delegation approached quietly. And when I say quietly, I mean their entire arrival felt like a whisper. They came aboard in simple suits, carrying briefcases, their faces pale and exhausted. These were not warriors fresh from battle. These were diplomats, statesmen, men who had watched their country pushed to the edge of destruction. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, dressed in formal attire, walked slowly due to an injury from a failed assassination attempt years earlier. He had a cane, and each step on that steel deck echoed faintly, the sound carrying across the hushed crowd. Behind him walked General Yoshijiro Umezu, representing the Imperial Japanese Army. His face was stern, tight, controlled. People who were there later said you could see a storm in his eyes, a mix of shame, bitterness, duty, and the crushing knowledge that the empire he had served was now ending. The Japanese delegates stood before the table where the surrender documents waited. A simple wooden table borrowed from the ship's officers' quarters. Nothing grand, nothing ornate, just wood and paper that would reshape the entire world. MacArthur began the ceremony with a short speech, and if you, Eve, are listen to the recordings, you'll notice something unusual. His voice was steady but softer than usual, touched with something close to humility. He spoke of peace, of sacrifice, of the hope that humanity might learn something from the blood it had spilled. It wasn't the voice of a conqueror. It was the voice of a man who'd buried too many soldiers to take any pleasure in victory. Then came the signing. Shigemitsu stepped forward first. His hands trembled slightly, not out of fear, but out of the sheer weight of history pressing down on him. The documents were laid out in careful order. The Japanese instrument of surrender, printed with the names of nations that had stood against Japan across oceans and continents. He adjusted his glasses, set his cane aside, and bent slowly over the paper. Witnesses remembered that moment with crystal clarity, the way he hesitated for just a second, the way the pen scratched softly against the page, a simple stroke of ink ending a global war. General Umezu signed next. His jaw was clenched, his shoulders tight. And when he finished, he stepped back with a sharp breath, like he'd just closed a door that would never open again. When MacArthur added his signature, he didn't lean in slowly the way the Japanese delegates had. He moved with crisp certainty. His pen glided across the page in strong strokes. Reporters nearby scribbled notes like mad, cameras clicked from every angle. Soldiers watched with damp eyes, some with clenched fists, others with hands clasped behind their backs to stop them from shaking. After MacArthur, representatives from each allied nation stepped forward in turn. Admiral Nimitz for the United States Navy, General HSU Yongchang for China, Admiral Fraser for Britain. Each man signed with a sense of gravity, as if they were sealing not just a document, but a promise to the millions who had died. And all around them, the deck of the Missouri stayed eerily silent. No cheering, no applause, just the distant cry of seabirds and the soft slap of water against steel. Some of the photographers later said you could feel the ghosts standing behind the delegates as they signed. The men who'd died at Pearl Harbor, the Marines who'd fallen on Tarawa and Peleliu, the civilians lost in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the pilots who disappeared over endless blue ocean never found again. All of them seemed to hover there in that strange gray light, watching the war that claimed them finally come to an end. When the ceremony finished, MacArthur stepped up again and gave a final short address. And it wasn't triumphant, it wasn't boastful, it was quiet, almost tender. He spoke of building a better world, one where people might solve their differences without armies. And though that dream still feels far away, you can hear the sincerity in his voice. The man had seen too much war to ever romanticize it. The flags fluttered overhead. The papers were collected. The Japanese delegation bowed and withdrew, and the officers on the Missouri did something very human. They exhaled. Some cried openly, others embraced. Some just stared at the sky, unable to believe what their ears had heard. After all the fighting, all the loss, all the years of fear and fatigue, it was over. Now this is where our story really begins to open up, because the ceremony was just the surface. Beneath it lay years of battles, political decisions, coded messages, secret doubts, and the quiet human stories that make these moments worth telling. Before we step deeper, let me gently pause for a moment. If you're enjoying this journey and you want more stories like this told with heart and care, go ahead and subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, maybe even share it with someone who loves history as much as you do. It keeps this old storyteller going. Alright, let's keep moving. And as the first official group stepped onto the deck of the Missouri, the mood shifted again, almost like someone had reached over and gently turned a dial. The Americans stood a little straighter. The British kept that calm dignity they were famous for. The Soviets scanned everything with eyes that never seemed to blink. The Australians looked weathered, proud, a bit suspicious maybe. And the Canadians and French carried themselves with a kind of quiet satisfaction, like they'd fought a long, brutal distance to earn their place here. But you know what struck many of the sailors more than the uniforms? It was the shoes, scuffed, mud-stained, worn thin by years of marching. It was a reminder that most of these men had lived through hell before walking onto this polished battleship in the calm Tokyo Bay. The Missouri crew later said the most impressive thing about the Allied delegation wasn't their medals or stars, but their exhaustion. They carried it like an invisible weight. You could see it in the slow exhale before they spoke, the momentary pause before shaking a hand or stepping forward. These were the people who hadn't just read the war reports. They had lived inside them. And now they were expected to give this day a sense of ceremony and dignity, even though many of them were probably thinking about the friends who didn't get to see it. General Douglas MacArthur made sure everything ran with exact timing, almost down to the second. Some people found him theatrical, others admired the way he stepped into a moment and owned it. On this day, though, even his critics admitted he carried himself like someone who understood the weight of history pressing down on his shoulders. The man had a flair for big stage moments, and this morning was bigger than any stage Hollywood could have built. At around 8:56 a.m., the Japanese delegation climbed the gangway. They moved slowly, not because they were physically weak, but because they were nervous, terrified even. Every eye on that ship followed them, and that kind of attention can feel like standing under a burning spotlight. Mamoru Shigemitsu, the foreign minister, leaned heavily on his cane. He'd lost a leg years earlier in an assassination attempt, and this awkward, limping ascent became one of the most photographed moments of the entire war. Behind him walked General Yoshijiro Umezu, the chief of the army staff. He looked like the ceiling of the world was about to collapse onto his back. None of the Japanese delegates wore swords, which was an enormous symbolic step. They were in every sense disarmed. Some of the more junior Japanese officers later admitted that they felt a deep shame, almost unbearable, standing in front of the men they had once expected to defeat. And yet, even in that shame, there was something admirable in how steady they kept their posture. They came to surrender, yes, but they also came to accept responsibility for a war that had torn apart half the planet. When they reached the table, Shigemitsu placed his hat down very carefully, like he was afraid that even the slightest clatter might offend someone. Then he lowered himself into the chair with great effort. His hands trembled when he picked up the pen, not dramatically, not enough to create a spectacle, but enough that the sailors closest to him noticed. One of them later wrote that this was the moment he realized how heavy the past 14 years of conflict had been for everyone, not just for the Allies. MacArthur opened the ceremony with a short speech. It was simple, direct, and stripped of anything unnecessary. He talked about the courage of the fighting men, the sacrifices made by millions of families, the devastation that had swept across continents, and the hope, fragile but real, that this surrender might finally allow the world to catch its breath. He spoke with a voice that was steady and almost soft, very different from the bold, booming way he sometimes addressed the press. This wasn't a moment for theatrics. This was a moment for truth. Journalists on board wrote later that you could hear the seagulls during his speech, not because he spoke quietly, but because no one else dared to move. The air was still heavy with anticipation. Even the engines of nearby ships seemed to quiet down out of respect. And then it was time. Shigemitsu reached for the first copy of the surrender document. The paper itself was plain, almost disappointingly so, considering the magnitude of what it represented. It wasn't decorated or fancy. It was the kind of paper you'd see in any government office. Maybe that's fitting. After all the bombs, the battles, the invasions, and the revolutions, the end of the deadliest war in human history came down to a handful of signatures on a few sheets of ordinary paper. He signed, Umezu signed. And with each stroke of the pen, 14 years of conflict between Japan and the Allies collapsed into history. When it was the Americans' turn, MacArthur signed for the United States, followed by Admiral Nimitz representing the Navy. And here's a detail most people don't know. The pen MacArthur used wasn't chosen for its elegance or symbolism. It was selected because it was the one in his pocket that morning. Later, he'd give some of those pens away as gifts to generals, to his wife, even to a museum. But in that moment, it was just a pen moving across paper while the world held its breath. The rest of the Allied delegates signed in order: China, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, Australia, Canada, France, the Netherlands, and New Zealand. Each signature took only a few seconds. But each signature represented cities burned to ash, young men buried thousands of miles from home, families who had waited and prayed for letters that never came. One Canadian witness later said that when he signed his name, he felt nothing. Not joy, not sorrow, not relief. He felt empty. Only later, back in his quarters, did he break down and cry, not because of the victory, but because he finally felt like his friends hadn't died for nothing. And while all of this was happening on the deck, the sky above became its own stage. Hundreds of American aircraft, fighters, bombers, transports flew overhead in perfect formation. The rumble of engines rolled across the bay like distant thunder. There's a famous story that one Japanese officer looked up, his face pale, and whispered, "We never had a chance." It wasn't meant for anyone to hear, but someone standing next to him caught it. The sheer scale of American air power that morning made even the most hardened officers realize how uneven the fight had truly become. When the ceremony ended, MacArthur gave one final speech. In it, he spoke about hope, faith, and the need for mankind to find a better path. He faced not just the Japanese delegation, but the entire world. And for a few brief minutes, the thousands of men on that ship, who had once scattered across oceans and islands to kill each other, listened to the same words, breathed the same air, and looked toward a future none of them could quite imagine. But let's pause for a moment, my friend, before we wander any farther into that future. If you've made it this deep into the story and you're enjoying the way we're walking through these moments together, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. It helps this little historical corner of YouTube stay alive, and it lets us keep exploring stories just like this. And hey, if you know someone who loves history as much as you, share the video with them. Now, let's head back into that morning on the Missouri. Because something subtle happened as the ceremony ended. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would show up in a newsreel, but the whole atmosphere shifted again, almost like someone exhaled for the first time in years. Men who'd held rigid posture through the entire event finally allowed their shoulders to relax. Someone in the back muttered, "It's over, it's really over," and another answered, "Feels strange, doesn't it?" Because the truth is, most of them hadn't let themselves believe the war could actually end. Not until they saw the ink sink into that paper. Some sailors glanced toward the Japanese delegation with a mixture of emotions they didn't quite know how to express. Anger, grief, pity, maybe even respect. It's complicated when you've been fighting someone for so long that they stop feeling like people and start feeling like symbols. But here they were, walking away like ordinary men again, slow, tired, humbled. An American Marine standing watch near the railing said he saw Shigemitsu pause for just a heartbeat and look out across the water toward Tokyo. No one knows what he was thinking, but the Marine guessed it wasn't pride or relief. It was probably worry about the people he had to return to, the ruined cities, the hungry children, and the path Japan would need to walk from this day onward. What most people don't realize is that after the ceremony ended, the USS Missouri didn't erupt into wild cheers. There wasn't a massive celebration on deck. There were smiles, yes, some handshakes. A few men quietly hugged each other, but overall the mood stayed strangely calm, like the ship understood that this was a time for reflection, not loud victory chants. Men drifted toward the railings to look out across Tokyo Bay, soaking in the stillness they hadn't known for so long. As the Japanese delegation stepped off the Missouri and their launch pulled away across the calm water, the men left on deck watched them go with a silence that didn't feel hostile anymore, just heavy. Some of the sailors later said that moment hit them harder than the ceremony itself. Seeing those small figures drifting away across the bay back toward a nation in ruins, it made the whole thing feel real in a way the signatures and speeches hadn't quite managed. It reminded everyone that wars don't end cleanly. They don't tie themselves up with neat bows. They just stop and leave people standing around trying to figure out what's left. The Missouri's captain, Stuart Murray, quietly ordered the ship's bell rung, not in celebration but as a mark of recognition. A kind of naval heartbeat acknowledging the moment. The clear metallic ring drifted across the water in slow, gentle pulses. There's no recording of it, but a Marine who stood close to the bell said the echo carried a feeling he couldn't explain, something between regret and relief. Men wandered the deck for a long time after that. No one was in a rush to go below. For years they'd lived under constant tension, and now, for the first time, nothing was expected of them. There were no aircraft alarms, no orders to prepare for bombardment, no need to watch the horizon for enemy silhouettes. Some just leaned on the railing and let the wind hit their faces. Others pulled out small notebooks or half-crumpled letters and scribbled messages home. A few simply closed their eyes and breathed, like they hadn't done something so simple in a long while. One sailor described smelling something on that morning he had noted. Since he'd left home, the clean scent of ocean air. It wasn't mixed with smoke or oil or the metallic bite of gunpowder, just ocean, just water and wind and sky. Small details like that can punch a man right in the heart after living through years of chaos. Farther across the bay, on the decks of other Allied ships, men who'd spent the morning watching through binoculars finally set them down and started talking quietly among themselves. Some laughed softly, some cried, some walked away alone because they needed a minute to let the weight of everything settle. You can't lose thousands of friends, cross oceans full of danger, walk through flames and mud and misery, and then just smile and call it a day. The end of a war is messy inside a man's heart. And while the Missouri remained calm, the bay around her slowly came alive with movement. Ships sounded their horns in long, deep notes that rolled through the morning like a slow, rising chorus. That sound carried all the way to the battered shores of Japan. For the civilians listening from miles away, it marked the end of terror, bombs, sirens, hunger, fear. Imagine hearing those horns and knowing that no more B-29s would thunder overhead at night, no more firestorms would sweep through wooden neighborhoods, no more windows would rattle with explosions. Imagine the mixture of hope and worry. What comes next? How do you rebuild a nation that's lost so much? Back on the Missouri, MacArthur didn't linger on the deck. He walked inside with the same steady stride he'd used to take the podium. People around him noticed he didn't smile or look relieved. He was already thinking about the job ahead, the occupation, the rebuilding, the trials, the reforms. Ending a war is one thing, building a peace that lasts is another beast entirely. And he knew the world would be watching. Down below, sailors in the mess hall gathered around radios as news crackled through. The war is officially over. Radio announcers around the world repeated those words with voices shaking from emotion. Some broadcast crews had prepared scripts, but many threw them aside and just spoke straight from the heart. Families listening in tiny apartments in London, Chicago, Sydney, and Paris burst into tears. Some shouted with joy, some whispered prayers. Some just sat there, stunned, trying to believe that this long nightmare had finally reached its final chapter. You know, the funny thing about history is that the biggest moments of all often feel strangely quiet when you're standing inside them. Think of it, 70 million lives lost, entire cities flattened, nations torn apart, and it ends not with thunder but with pens scratching on paper and the distant hum of engines overhead. That's the part that always gets me. The world doesn't end or heal with spectacle. It happens in small human moments. There's a story the Missouri's chaplain told years later. After the ceremony, he walked the deck and saw a group of young sailors sitting in a circle, passing around a small tin of peaches they'd been saving for something special. They were eating in silence, just taking spoonfuls and handing the can along. When he asked them why they were so quiet, one of them said, "Chaplain, I think we just forgot how to celebrate." That line stuck with him for the rest of his life. Later that afternoon, the Missouri raised a massive American flag, one with a story of its own. It wasn't a new flag stitched for the occasion. It was the same flag that had flown over the U.S. Capitol on December 7, 1941, the day Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. President Truman had ordered it brought aboard the Missouri so that the war would end under the same colors it began. 4 years earlier, that flag had waved over stunned, heartbroken Americans listening to news of burning ships and thousands dead. Now it billowed above calm waters where the enemy had just surrendered. Life has a way of circling back on itself in the most poetic ways. As sunset approached, the sky turned the color of old gold, and the men on deck watched the light fall across Japan's coastline. Most had never seen the country up close. They defought it across maps and islands, through jungles and mountains, from carriers and bombers and foxholes. Now they looked at its quiet hills and villages and wondered what stories lay beneath that silence. Not enemies anymore, just people who had suffered in their own ways. It's strange how quickly war can turn human beings into ideas and shadows. But peace has a way of reminding you that every uniform hides a person with a family, a language, a childhood, a favorite meal, fears, hopes. All things that get blurred, then lost when the shooting starts. That night, the Missouri slept under the calm glow of lanterns and the soft slap of waves against steel. Men who'd spent years sleeping with one eye open finally drifted into something close to real rest. Some dreamed of home porches, kitchens, small-town streets. Some dreamed of the friends they'd lost. And some didn't dream at all because their bodies were too exhausted to do anything but sink into the deepest sleep they'd felt in years. In Tokyo, the Japanese delegation returned to government buildings that barely stood upright. Papers lay scattered everywhere, windows shattered, faces hollow. Ministers and generals sat at long tables, staring at the documents that marked the end of the empire they had sworn to defend. Many didn't speak for a long time. What could they say? The world they had imagined, the war they had fueled, the victories they once believed were destined, it had all collapsed. And tomorrow, they'd have to wake up and begin the painful work of rebuilding. You know, before we go any farther, let me just pause right here for a second. If you're still with me, if you're walking through this day on the Missouri and feeling these stories in your chest, I'd really appreciate it if you'd hit the subscribe button. It keeps this channel going, helps these long human stories find more people, and makes a world of difference. And if you feel like sharing this video with someone else who loves history, even better. Alright, let's keep going. In the weeks that followed, the Missouri and the thousands of ships around her slowly pulled away from Japan. Troops returned home in waves. The trains in America filled with uniforms, families gathered at stations with hand-painted signs. You can picture it, a father with his child on his shoulders, craning to see through the crowd, a young wife holding her breath as each new group steps off the train, a mother clutching a photograph against her chest, praying her son is on that next car. Those reunions, those raw, beautiful moments, became their own chapter in the story. So many tears, so many hands gripping each other's faces as if afraid to let go. But for many others, homecomings were quieter. A folded flag instead of a hug, a knock on the door instead of a joyful train station. The end of a war brings joy and heartbreak in equal measure, and families carried both for decades. As for the Missouri, she sailed on. She became a symbol not of American power but of closure. Sailors who served aboard her after the war would sometimes pause at the exact spot where the table once stood. Some touched the deck there, almost like paying respect. Some whispered their own small prayers. The wood beneath their boots held memories that would outlast them all. Years later, long after the war had faded into books and documentaries, survivors from all sides, American, Japanese, British, would meet at reunions and exchange stories. Men who once tried to kill each other sat side by side with cups of tea or coffee, talking like old neighbors. Time has a way of sanding down the sharpest edges, not erasing them, but softening them just enough for understanding to slip through. And the strange thing is, when these veterans talked about the surrender ceremony, they rarely spoke of strategy or politics. They spoke about sounds, the shuffle of feet on steel, the rustle of paper, the hum of planes overhead, the silence between words. Those sensory moments stayed with them more than anything else, because in those tiny pockets of time, they felt the world turning. When I think back on that morning in Tokyo Bay, I always return to the people who stood there. Not the generals or admirals, though they played their roles. I mean the young men with grease under their fingernails, the cooks who'd served breakfast before the ceremony, the radio operators, the signalmen, the deckhands who'd polished the brass rails the night before. Ordinary people who witnessed the extraordinary. They didn't know they were standing inside one of the most important moments of the 20th century. They were just doing their jobs. But history loves people like that. Quiet souls who unintentionally become the eyes and ears of their era. And in some ways, that's why this story feels so human. Because the end of World War II didn't belong to a handful of leaders, it belonged to millions of people, each carrying their own little piece of the journey. The victory, the loss, the hope, the grief, all of it mixed together. As the years rolled on, the Missouri eventually retired and became a museum. Tourists walk her deck now, tracing their fingers over the same railings, looking out at the same wide ocean. Some stand on the exact wooden planks where the surrender table once rested, and they close their eyes for a second. You can almost hear the echoes if you listen hard enough. And though the story of the Missouri isn't about the dambusters, I can't help but think about men like them, crews who flew impossible missions, who trained in silence, who risked everything for the chance to shorten the war by even a single night. Their spirit hangs over every tale from that era, that stubborn resilience, that refusal to back down even when the sky itself seemed ready to collapse. The end of the war aboard the Missouri was built on the courage of countless souls like that. People who pushed forward when logic said they shouldn't. People who believed fiercely that darkness doesn't get the final word. When the sun rose over Tokyo Bay on the morning after the ceremony, the water was calm again. Almost too calm, but maybe that's fitting. After all the storms, after all the fire and fear and thunder, the world deserved a quiet morning. A clean sky, a small breath of peace. And that's where this story leaves us. With a ship resting on still water, with tired men finally able to close their eyes, with nations beginning the slow, painful climb toward healing, and with the memory of brave souls, airmen, sailors, soldiers, echoing gently in the background, reminding us what it took to reach that morning on the Missouri.